So you know, this is kind of me making an excuse ahead of time. I'm going to give you a lot of information tonight, and I normally try to have some kind of an application toward the end. There is simply so much information, I'm going to suddenly stop. And so it's up to you to be thinking about how this applies, because I don't know. But, and also, we did Daniel chapter 8 last week, and I told you I hadn't covered it all. And so I'm doing more this week, and I'm still not covering it all. Don't know what we'll do next week, but I'm just going to go through some verses that we didn't really deal with and talk about what they have to say. And as always, much of this is what I believe and how I see things, but I want to be fair-minded and even-handed and make allowances for the fact that I certainly don't know everything, and there's other ways to look at these. And when possible, I'll try to identify other points of view that I think have merit. So, Daniel chapter 8, let's begin reading verses 9 and 10. Out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. It grew great even to the host of heaven, and some of the host and some of the stars it threw to the ground and trampled on them. So, we've been reading the book of Daniel now, and the more we get into this part of it, you're going to see a lot of horns, like horn of a beast. And he sees so many of them in his visions that they kind of become confusing. So like, for example, back in chapter 7, we talked about the 4 beasts that he sees in his vision, and the 4th beast, the terrifying one that's very destructive and violent. There's a little horn that emerges out of that one. And I kind of walked you through the debate that scholars and pastors and Christians have had for years over whether this little horn represents a leader from the past, like Antiochus Epiphanes, which we talked about, or is it a leader in the future? And some people say it's the Antichrist. And what I kind of said was that it's not easy to say definitively either way, and it could be both. And now we're in chapter 8, and we touched on this a little bit last week. There's another horn we read about, and this horn represents Alexander the Great. It's in verse 5. As I was considering, behold, a male goat came from the west, crossed the face of the whole earth without touching the ground, so that is representative of Alexander's army moving with great speed. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. And again, I'm not going to go through all the details, but when you study it out, that's definitely Alexander the Great, the general of that army. And then Daniel gets shown the end of Alexander's empire, where he dies at age 33, and his kingdom gets split into 4 smaller, I'll call them empires, or political organizations. I don't know what you want to call them. Call them empires.
Yeah.
And so verse 8 talks about them. Then the goat became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn, Alexander, was broken, and instead of it, there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. So those are the division. That's the division of his empire among his generals. And the main ones are the Ptolemies. You may have heard of them. They take over Egypt. The Seleucids, who are over Asia Minor and parts of the Middle East. There's a couple other ones that don't really make much impact at all. Those are the main ones. And out of these 4 empires, eventually another little horn emerges, and he's focused on particularly the land of Israel. Verse 9, out of one of them, the 4 empires that came out of Alexander's empire, came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and here it is, toward the glorious land. And that's clearly a reference to Israel in the context of what Daniel's saying. And when I say this individual is focused on Israel, it's not a positive focus, it's a destructive, malicious focus, which you see when you pick up in verse 10. It, the horn, grew great even to the host of heaven, and some of the host and some of the stars. By the way, the word host there, let me pause real quick, is a Hebrew word that can be translated armies, or army. So just so you know that when you see that in the Old Testament. Some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. It became great, even as great as the prince of the host, and the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown, and a host will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offering because of transgression, and it will throw truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper. So, the question then people have asked, who's this referring to? Who's this little horn? And my belief is that this is Antiochus IV, or Antiochus Epiphanes. We've already talked about him. He came out of one of the streams of Alexander's empire when it broke up. And when you study his story, and we're going to talk about him a lot today, I think this passage fits with him perfectly. So I want to talk about him because when you know about Antiochus, I think it helps you to understand this part of Daniel. So we're going to get into some details here. We know that Alexander the Great died in 323 BC, and according to history, his kingdom then was divided among his 4 generals. And one of those generals was a man by the name of Seleucus, and he became the first leader of what was called the Seleucid Empire, and that's important. The Seleucids ruled over significant portions of the Middle East, including the areas we know today as Iraq and Iran, Afghanistan, Syria, and Lebanon. They also went into parts of North Africa, and they were a dominant military force until about the 2nd century BC, when they were defeated by the Romans, because the Romans were emerging and nobody could withstand the Romans. Now, essentially what happens at that point, they disappear from history. The Seleucids cease to exist, and very likely they would have been forgotten by everyone other than historians, because they're gone. Except for this one member of the Seleucid dynasty. He became infamous, and I'm talking about Antiochus. He became infamous for what he did to the Jews, and the reason it continued through history is because the Jews were, and still are, a highly literate culture. They write their history, they preserve what they've written as much as they can, and so these stories of what he did were told back then, and they have continued to be told even to our own day. So again, his name was Antiochus IV, and he became king of that Seleucid Empire in 175 BC. Now, he was ambitious, to say it politely. He was an ambitious guy. He was already in control of huge swaths of the world, but he wanted more. And so, in an effort to increase his territory, he began invading other lands that were under the control of others. One of those lands that he invaded was Judea, or it was called Palestine as well, like it is today in some ways. And Judea at that point was under the control of the Ptolemies, one of the other 4 streams of Alexander's empire. And they were centered in Egypt. And interesting, I don't know how many of you know this, the Ptolemies were the stream of leaders that Cleopatra came from. So kind of interesting. Not really relevant, but whatever, fascinating to me. So
it is relevant because that line, they're not Egyptian.
Right.
So that's
right.
That
like the Hyksos later on
the
too.
Egyptian
Yeah.
Empire.
Yeah.
Everybody from there on was not Egyptian. They were always Greek and whatnot.
Foreign interlopers.
It is important. So.
Yeah. True enough. So Antiochus brings his army, and he invades Judea, and he drives the Ptolemies out, and then he leaves a small force, a very small force of soldiers to keep control in Judea, in particular Jerusalem, and he heads toward Egypt. And he's going to try to defeat the Ptolemaic dynasty as a whole, because he wants all of Egypt for himself. Because again, he's very, very ambitious, very, very keen on expanding his territory and control of parts of the world. And one of the things he does before he leaves Judea, he replaces the Jewish high priest with someone who was a friend of his and who offered him a bribe. And the reason he did this, the high priest played such an important role in Jewish religion that his word had outsized influence, way more influence than others. And so he appoints this man to kind of help keep the Jews under control. Now, at this point, Antiochus is not and I'm saying this carefully, at this point, he's not considered to be a bad guy in Jewish history.
Getting there.
He's one more foreign king who had ruled over them, but at this point he's not particularly harsh, he's not particularly repressive. He was one of those conquerors who, whenever he invaded a nation, as long as the people essentially submitted to him and cooperated, he would be pretty reasonable with them. He'd allow them to keep their culture, keep their religion, keep some local government, speak their language, all these kinds of things. But he didn't realize one thing, which was, even though the Jews were having some spiritual problems at the time, they still took their religion seriously. They were kind of in that hypocritic thing where they were serving God but not. But they did take their religion seriously on the level that nobody, in their thinking, nobody should ever be allowed to replace the high priest, because he was a representative of God to them. And so this was his big mistake in dealing with the Jews. He kicks out the existing high priest, a man by the name of Jason, brings in this guy that's his supporter, and then he takes off for Egypt, and there he's going to fight the Ptolemies. Well, he's only gone for a few months, and word comes back to Judea, and I touched on this last time. Word came back that reports that he'd been killed in battle. And so the Jews, like, yeah, obviously, God's against this guy, and God has struck him down, and this is God's judgment. And they also took it as a sign, not only had God judged Antiochus, this was God's sign that it was time to restore Jason, the previous high priest, who he had kicked out of Jerusalem. So Jason, this former high priest, along with about 1,000 of his followers, gather up some weapons, and they've been hiding outside of Jerusalem. They begin a march on Jerusalem, and they're going to restore Jason, and they're going to restore the priesthood to what they felt it should be. But what they didn't know, and again, I told you this last week, so it's a little bit of a repeating here, the reports of Antiochus' death were false. He hadn't been killed, he hadn't died. And so they're coming into Jerusalem, they're starting a battle to retake control of the temple area and the priesthood. And all the way in Egypt, Antiochus gets a report of what's happening back in Judea. And he was one of those guys, again, as long as you cooperated and submitted, he was okay. But he was pretty thin-skinned otherwise. And so he essentially stops his plans to go to war against the Ptolemies, and he brings his army back to Jerusalem to teach these Jews a lesson. And we again, I'm not going to repeat all the details because I went into quite a bit of detail last time, but essentially in the space of 3 days, he slaughters 40,000 Jews, a tremendous number of them women and children. Then he goes into the temple, and he goes not just into the temple courtyard and then the holy place. He goes into the Holy of Holies, the most holy place. He slaughters a pig on the altar, and he takes the blood of a pig and mingles it with oil and splatters it all over the scrolls, the sacred writings, and the vessels in the temple, and it gets worse. Then he kills Jason, the former high priest, kills as many of his followers as he could find, and at that point he thinks he's taught the Jews a lesson, and he goes back to Egypt to continue his war against the Ptolemies. So he's on the march toward Egypt, and he's feeling, like he's avenged himself properly. And he's almost in Egypt, getting ready to start the war, and the Romans have heard about this. Now remember, the Romans are the rising power. They're stronger than him. And they send him a message: we don't want you in control of Egypt. And essentially saying, if you attack the Ptolemies in Egypt, who are our allies, then you're going to be at war with us. And the Romans were too strong. He could defeat the Jews. He could defeat a lot of armies, but he could not in any way defeat the Romans. And so he stops and he withdraws from Egypt, but he's angry. He's embarrassed, he's ashamed, because he gave up without a fight, because he knew he couldn't win. So because his ambitions are thwarted, he's angry, and he wants to take it out on someone. And he remembers his most recent enemies, the Jews, who had given him such problems that he takes his army back to Judea, and he leads a second invasion and he commits more atrocities just because he's angry at the Romans, but the Jews become the whipping boy, so to speak. And this time, he invades, and on the particular Sabbath, he reaches Jerusalem, and the first thing he does, he looses his soldiers, and they kill every Jew they find at the temple. They go in the temple, they're in the temple courtyard, they kill every single Jewish person they can. And once that's done, and he's killed a lot more Jews outside the temple area, he enacts some laws. He bans all Jewish worship. In other words, no sacrifices can be made to the Jewish God in the Jewish style. And then he takes a statue of the Greek god Zeus, because he's a Greek, and he has it placed in the Jewish temple, which would have been sacrilege, desecration. I mean, you name the word, right? This is really, really bad. And I believe, and I'm using that phrase on purpose, I believe, you don't have to agree with me, this is what Daniel was talking about in Daniel 8, verses 9 through 11, okay? And I'm going to read it and we're going to explain it a little more. Out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land, Israel. It grew great even to the host of heaven, and some of the host and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. It became great even as the prince of the host, and the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. Now, people read that and understandably say, well, that can't apply to Antiochus because he was a human being. And this language is describing spiritual beings. It describes what he did, but it gives it says the entities that did it were spiritual beings. That's clear language, right? And so here's what I believe, that this isn't only about Antiochus. In my view, it's also describing the spiritual beings, demonic spirits I would call them, which I believe would have been working in the spiritual realm as a very real part of what he was doing in the physical realm. So I think there's a spiritual thing happening here and a physical thing. Evil spirits, demonic spirits attacking the worship of the Jews. And then there's this evil man who's actually physically killing them and desecrating their place of worship. And the reason, as Daniel sees in the vision, was because of the sin that the Jewish people had become involved in. And that's in verse 12. And a host will be given over it together with the regular burnt offering because of transgression. You see that? Transgression, sin, wrongdoing. And it will be thrown to the ground, and that's this little horn, will act and prosper. So he succeeds in what he's doing. That's what the word prosper means in that context. What he attempts to do, he succeeds in doing. He casts down Jewish worship, kills a bunch of God's people, and desecrates the temple. Now, that's what Daniel's seeing happening. And then, if you keep reading the vision, he also hears from some angel how long this is going to continue. This is where it gets a little more interesting here and a little more difficult, but we'll kind of try to work through it. Verses 13 and 14. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, "For how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate," remember the pig on the altar from earlier, and now this, the statue of Zeus, "and the giving over of the sanctuary and host to be trampled underfoot." Now here's where it gets a little bit speculative for us to interpret. And he said to me, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state." So obviously, people have asked, well, what does those 2,300 evenings and mornings stand for? And I want to suggest two possible interpretations. These are the two main ones. There are others out there, but I don't find them very compelling. First of all, people say, well, it's 2,300 days. Evening and morning makes for a day, which when you do the math works out to roughly a little over 6 years. And that was the total length of time that Antiochus oppressed the Jewish people from the very first invasion until the time that he died. So it could be that, 2,300 days, give or take, right? But then there are some Old Testament scholars that have said that's a really an unusual way to say it, 2,300 evenings and mornings. And in Hebrew, it's possible that grammatically it could be dividing them. So there was 1,150 evenings and 1,150 mornings, which then works out to a period of just over 3 years. And that would also work, because that's the time from the time when Antiochus desecrated the temple with the statue of Zeus until he died. So he didn't do it immediately on the second invasion. It waited for a couple of years before he was still angry at them, and he brings in the statue and puts it there again to insult their religion. Both of these are possible, grammatically, historically, and frankly, I'm not sure which one it is, if I'm right at all. And I don't see that either one of those perspectives changes the overall message. Either way, they fit. So it could have been 6 years of oppression, or just 3 years of oppression from the time of his statue of Zeus. I don't know. And then there's one final thing that I want to say before we wrap this up, and it needs to be talked about. A lot of people think, scholars, people that I respect, that this part of Daniel's vision, and I'm saying it's mostly Antiochus, they say, well, it was only partly fulfilled by Antiochus, that it did apply to what he did, but they also say that it refers to what someone in the future will do again, and typically that individual is identified as an Antichrist type of figure. And the reason people say that isn't just because they're speculating, it's because when you read what Gabriel says to Daniel, it kind of seems to say that. Verses 16 and 17. That should be 16 and 17. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, that's a river, and it called, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. So he came near to where I stood, and when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, understand, O man, that the vision is for the time of the end. So they said, well, this can't apply to Antiochus because that's not the end. And here's where I come down. My view. I think it's both. I think it is about Antiochus, but I think it's also about something that's going to happen in the future. And I'm not willing to speculate on Antichrist and all that stuff, because that's a whole separate thing. But the reason I say that is because something that the angel says to Daniel, again, he describes what Antiochus does, he connects it with the end, which I'll read to you in a second here, and then many, many years later, Jesus will take the same phrase out of Daniel, and he'll apply it to the future. So here the angel applies it to Antiochus, I believe, in verse 19. He said, behold, I will make known to you what shall be at the latter end of the indignation. That's the abomination that causes desolation, for it refers to the appointed time of the end. So the angel here is saying, it's Antiochus. What he does in the temple is the end. But then Jesus in Matthew 24 quotes this. And he says, no, this is also about something that's happening in the future. Matthew 24, verse 15. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Now, here's what you have to remember. If you break down the chronology in the timeline, Jesus is speaking 200 years, roughly, after Antiochus did what he did in the Jewish temple. So I could be wrong. This may not be about Antiochus at all, but yet Daniel 8:19 seems to say that it is. That's why I say I think it's both. It happened under Antiochus, but it's going to happen again after Jesus utters these words. Here's the question, here's where we're going to wrap it up. If Jesus wasn't referring to Antiochus, and he wasn't, then what was he referring to? And I'm not going to get into detail on this because it's still to be seen, but I'm just going to put this out there for you. There are two main possibilities that most scholars agree on that Jesus was referring to. Number one, he could be referring to a future event, something that's yet to happen even in our day. It hasn't happened, and a lot of people associate this future event with the person they call the Antichrist. Okay? That might be what he's saying. Matthew 24:15, and there's more in Matthew 24 about it. But secondly, Jesus could be referring to AD 70. And if you know what happened then, the Roman general Titus invaded Judea, and he attacked Jerusalem in particular because of a rebellion of the Jewish people against Rome. And he not only destroys Jerusalem, I mean basically reduces it to rubble, he destroys the temple. After that was all done, they brought in Roman idols of their false gods and put them in the place of the temple courtyard, which again had been destroyed, but people knew where it was. They erected all these pagan statues and idols. And so those are the two possibilities that most people say. Either it's in the future, it hasn't happened yet, the Antichrist, or they're saying, no, it happened with the Romans and General Titus. And frankly, my opinion, don't get mad at me if you don't agree with me. My opinion, I think Jesus was talking about the Roman invasion in AD 70. But I have to just tell you, I don't know for sure. It's my opinion. And maybe it's a tripart fulfillment. Maybe there's more to come still. And so I don't know for sure, and it's up to you to decide what you think. So I've given you a lot of information and very little practical. I know that. I haven't wound it up with okay, here's what it means. So I have no idea where discussion is going to go tonight. But either you'll be like Gary, you're off your rocker, or some of you have some really wise things to say.